Deloitte Canada has released a new report entitled Electrified Fleets Pave the Way to Emissions Reductions. We're talking about electric vehicles, electric commercial vehicles. And I'm going to speak to Elizabeth Baker, who is a partner in Deloitte's supply chain and network operations practice and one of the co authors of the report. So, welcome to the interview, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. Now, I'm really interested in this because a lot of the public attention gets paid to the sexy side of the business, the light duty cars and trucks, the Lightning F-150, the Teslas, that sort of thing. But from Canada's point of view, the real action, I think, and I've thought this way for a long time, is really in the medium and heavy duty side. There's a lot we can do here. And maybe we'll start with just kind of an overview of what is Deloitte recommending to speed up the electrification of commercial fleets?
Yeah, well, first off, your observation is absolutely right. 25% of Canada's emissions comes from transport, and that's light, medium, and heavy duty vehicles. And so the impact of our emissions reduction isn't going to be from passenger vehicles. It's going to be from commercial fleets and government fleets. And that's really where the rubber will hit the road, as we could say, for electrification. What we're looking at from a Deloitte perspective is there's been a lot of analysis and activity around our net zero 2050 target, around the 2030 emissions reduction plan. There hasn't necessarily been as much movement towards, so what does that mean for those commercial and government fleets? 2030 is only 7 years away. There's a lot to be done in order to hit those emission reduction plans that are out there. And so what we're looking to is how do we make it tangible and realistic to put some plans together, to put some strategies together and start moving towards action to make those things happen.
Now, I was in Edmonton a couple of weeks ago and I attended the launch of the Alberta Motor Trucking Association's Class 8 semi-truck hydrogen semi-truck pilot project. So they're going to have two of these units hauling freight back and forth between Calgary and Edmonton. They want to see, how the fuel cells work, how do they operate in wintertime, what kind of repairs and maintenance and fueling infrastructure do they need, all of that good stuff. And while I was there, I had a chance to talk to Rael Durant, who is a Calgary manager for Bison Transport. They're one of the partners. And so they'll be a carrier that's participating in this pilot project. And I wonder if there aren't, if other carriers across Canada are participating in similar kinds of pilot projects.
Yeah, so lots of pilots underway, multiple, couriers, large carriers. They're all starting with, a few trucks here and there at different places across the country to test different temperatures, different topography, see what kind of range they will be getting from these vehicles to really start to understand what's the inputs they need to then roll out at some sort of scale. And so the demand there is really growing. The commercial fleets are piloting, government is piloting, and really what we're starting to see the gap on is the supply side. And so there are many, as you mentioned, OEMs that have prototypes out there that are starting to hit the market, but they're not yet at a scale where an entire fleet could transition, or 60% of a fleet could transition. And so there's some work that needs to be done on that side to make sure that the supply, as the demand continues to grow out to 2030, can meet that demand.
I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but a little bit of context, because we talked, you mentioned in your first answer that commercial transportation made up X percentage of transportation emissions in Canada. And I wonder if that isn't a little bit higher, because I've done a couple of stories, including one with Provincial Trucking Association, which just flat out acknowledges that tampering with emissions equipment on these big trucks is just commonplace. In fact, you could go into a lot of these speed shops, automotive shops, and you can buy them right over the counter. The equipment needed to modify them so that gives you more power but increases emissions. So the problem, in fact, may be even bigger than we imagine.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I hadn't heard that before. One of the ways that we've been working with clients around measuring emissions is using telematics within the trucks to look at fuel usage and distance to understand what sort of emissions you may be getting. I agree. I think whatever the number is for the emissions, we're in an existential turning point for our country where we need to make some changes, and this is one of them that will have a big impact.
Now when I was talking to Riel Duran from Bison Transport, he made it very clear that their company is very keen to reduce its emissions. They want to be compliant, and I'm sure they're getting a little heat over emissions tampering. And so they're keen about this, but the emissions are kind of the first phase. What they're hoping for is that 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, there's going to be a tipping point where actually the total cost of ownership of those vehicles will be less than the diesel version or the internal combustion engine version. Did you find that during your report, your study?
That's exactly what we found from our analysis. So as you think about the carbon tax increasing, the cost of fuel increasing, when you look at the amount of electricity that these vehicles use versus the amount of fuel that they use, it's actually much less. So even if the cost of electricity increases, the amount that it's using is much less. They also have a much lower maintenance cost because they have much fewer moving parts when you think about a motor versus an engine. And so the maintenance on them is expected to be much lower. We're also expecting the cost of them to come down over the next 7 years. So as we think about, what drives the cost down, it's increased supply. So as more of the auto manufacturers move into the space, as they start to figure out production, supply chains, closing some of those challenges that they're seeing today, we do expect the overall capital cost to come down.
Now, I also had a chance to interview a vice president from Nikola Motors. So they're manufacturing electric trucks, but also hydrogen trucks. And one of the questions I asked him is how important it is to have first mover advantage? Because at this point, Canada is seen as, if not first mover, I mean, it's if it's not leading the pack, it's at least quite progressive and is up in the top 5 or whatever. And he made the point that when it comes to building infrastructure, when it comes to attracting manufacturing, when it comes to attracting supply chains, that is an area where the first movers have an advantage if they can leverage it. Would you agree with that?
I completely agree. And I think there's two sides of that first mover advantage. So the first is the fleets themselves, particularly for commercial fleets. There are federal and provincial subsidies currently available, both for vehicles and infrastructure, that can help offset some of that capital cost of the initial setup. Now, those are, have set envelope amounts, or they have times on when those envelopes are going to close. And so applying for those in the near term can certainly ensure that there's some of that reduction in capital costs. There's also some advantage for first mover for Canada in general. So as we think about, how do we think about making sure that the ecosystems are well connected, that we could become a supplier for ourselves, given our access to raw materials, critical minerals, the automotive cluster, starting to make some of those connections and have some of those national conversations that need to happen to pull those threads through could help Canada become a first mover in making our own supply.
And I think it should be pointed out that we're not just talking about delivery vans and semi trucks. Transit is a big medium and heavy duty transportation sector or subsector maybe. And we already have at least 3 electric bus manufacturers in Canada. We've got Lion Electric in Quebec, we've got New Flyer in Manitoba, and Green Power in Vancouver. And at least in 2 of those cases, they do a lot of their manufacturing in the US. Even though the design work and engineering work may be done in Canada, the manufacturing is in the US. So it seems like there's, if we put in place the right regulatory framework and the right incentives to get some of that manufacturing reshored and the supply chains that come with it, which is really part of the critical mass here. Is there an opportunity for that, or are we just doomed to always be losing that to the US?
I think the opportunity is there in front of us. And I think it's really about what do we do? What does the government do? What do the clusters do? How do we work together to start to pull that into the Canadian ecosystem? The other part of that is it's not just vehicles, it's chargers. The amount of chargers and electrical equipment that's going to be needed, switches, transformers, conduits, there's a benefit for Canada to invest in this type of production as we expand beyond electrical vehicles into other areas of the energy transition.
Well, Elizabeth, this has been fascinating. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Perfect. Thank you.